with the skull and the crossbones. You felt it was his inner identity of a rebel, of somebody who was fighting the system. I think Al was a genius, and I think he was a visionary. And I think part of his vision was, the hell with the rules. He had such a strong sense of himself that he would do it his way, and his way was right. Early in his career, it served him well. Later on, I'm not sure that it did.
Al Davis took the first steps in his professional journey as offensive ends coach with the then Los Angeles Chargers in 1960. Amazingly, just 3 short years later, he was elevated to the dual role of head coach and general manager for the AFL's fledgling franchise, the Oakland Raiders. His impact was immediate as the team recorded its first winning season in 4 years of existence. The uber-confident Davis was rewarded by being named the unanimous selection as the AFL's Coach of the Year.
His vision of football was cutting edge at that time. When he was great, I think he was probably, along with Paul Brown, along with Bill Walsh, the cutting edge, the genius of football. He had a very clear idea of how to play football. If we talk about offense, with the long pass, the great quarterbacks that he had, Bill Walsh, who I wrote a book on, told me that everything he learned about football, he learned from Al Davis. He always gave Al tremendous credit. Al was a guy who divided the world into them and us, beyond anyone I've ever met in my life. If you were us, you were loved. You felt so appreciated, and you would do anything for him, and these teams would. They admired him so much. But if you were them, you better watch out.
He was a bigger-than-life personality, and you know, what stands out for me more than anything else, I think, David, is how loyal he was. And I can only tell you a personal story. When my own contract didn't get renewed in my first local news job in San Francisco at KPIX, actually, the very first person to call me was Al Davis and said, look, anything that I can do, if you need a recommendation, if you need work, if you need money, anything that you need, I'm there for you. Very first call, and like I'm sure a lot of other people, I've never forgotten it.
I don't mean to deviate, but I got to ask you, did you take him up on that offer?
No, I didn't have to, fortunately. You know, and I couldn't throw a pass, and I couldn't run fast. So I'd never be a part of his plans with the Raiders. But he was like that, you know. And believe me, I was a very small part of that. But you know, all his players, and I'm sure you guys have been talking about this all along today. But all his players just really had a real love for the man, and I think that's true from top to bottom. You know, even the guys who were marginal guys. It wasn't only the Jim Ottos and Jim Plunkett's and, you know, Raymond Chesters and, you know, those type of guys who loved him. I mean, there were guys who played here for a year, played in Oakland for a year or two, and went on to other teams who still carried that about Al Davis. I mean, he was unique in every possible way, most of them in a really good way.
When you look at the depth of his career, Barry, is there one thing that stands out as being the most impressive to you? And I know that is an awfully difficult thing to say, but I mean, here's a guy who wore just about every hat in professional football that could possibly be worn. He ascended up the food chain in a rapid-fire fashion. Is there something really that stands out to you as, hey, this is really what was impressive about Al?
You know, I don't know if there's any one thing, but I can tell you Bill King, who for so many years did the radio broadcast of the Raiders, used to say, and I believed him, and I was around at this time too, that there's a lot of smart football guys around in the National Football League, and Al Davis lapped the field. I mean, he was truly the smartest guy I've ever met in football in his time. He's one of the only people that I've ever seen. You know, you and I and everybody in our business has been to 1,000 football practices, and as many football practices as I've been to, I can't honestly tell you I know a lot of what I'm looking at in a football practice. But Al Davis he would pull a receiver out of a route and say, now you see that first jab step, you did that wrong. You got to go this way. He would take an offensive tackle and he said, see that first drop step you made, that wasn't a good drop step. That's going to get you off balance. He could see things in a practice that I truly believe that even great football minds, great coaches couldn't see. He really understood the game, understood what he was watching, and he took that with him, I think, to every level. You know, as an assistant coach, as a head coach, as a general manager, as a commissioner. You know, I think at every level, at one time, he was the smartest guy in the game.
Barry, let me ask this, though, as sort of a back-ended way of getting back to what you said. Did that also hurt him at times? Because being the smartest guy in the room almost prevented maybe other people from not challenging his ideas, but sharpening them and honing them even sharper. That maybe because he would intimidate whoever was in the room, that sometimes he didn't get the benefit of outside wisdom.
Yeah, definitely. And you were around, Rat. You know what that's all about. I mean, I think with the Raiders, the simple fact was everybody had an opinion, but there was only one that counted, and that was Al Davis's, you know. I think maybe when Ron Wolf was there, he might have had Al's ear, and maybe because they were on the same page philosophically about what constitutes a good football player. And he may have been the only guy. But the truth of the matter is there was only one opinion in the room, and that was Al Davis's opinion. And unfortunately, you know, in recent years, that opinion might not have always been the best opinion. But there was a time when you had to go pretty far, I think, to be, you know, more astute in the game of football.
If you look back in hindsight, the NFL will say, we've never had anybody like Al Davis. But to live with Al Davis was the problem. He was difficult to live with because he was always taking you to court, right? He was going to move the team to Los Angeles against the vote of the owners. I was down there when they took that vote in Palm Springs. And let me create a vignette for you. 27 owners said you can't move, 5 abstained, giving themselves the right to move down the road, like Irsay, who moved the Colts from Baltimore to Indianapolis, and Al Davis didn't vote. So they're down there, and this is a very critical time in the NFL. Is Al Davis, for once, going to side with the other owners? Well, I'm down there for this historic vote, and all the owners are sitting around, you know, on off hours, they're sitting around having a cocktail on the pool, and you look over at Al Davis's room, he had flown his weights down. And while these other owners are having cocktails and try to keep Al Davis from moving, he's on his patio pumping iron. I mean, it's only Al Davis. Only Al Davis.
Glenn Dickey joins us, one of the best writers of all time, in my opinion. Loved him and great respect for him. Mr. Dickey, thank you for joining us. I know you still do some writing on the internet as well on your website. When you have to sum up this story, tell us how you go by it and what are your memories of Al Davis?
Oh, they're so complex, it's hard to say. I've already written 2 columns today, one for the Examiner on their website and one for Pro Football Weekly, which they'll put on their website. But you know, I covered the Raiders 1967 through 71, and I just learned, as I said in my Examiner column today, I learned so much from him because when I started, I thought I knew quite a bit about football. I've been watching it for a long time. I covered college football for the Chronicle. But you know, the first time I talked to Davis, I realized how little I knew. And so from that point on, anytime he was willing to talk, I just listened and learned, you know. And because he knew so much about the game, how it worked. I mean, we would talk about players, individual players, and he'd say, this guy is the 6th best tight end in the league, or we need to get better at this position because we've only got the 4th best offensive tackle, you know, that type of thing. He just really was at the top of his game at that point, and he had just had so much influence on the game. You know, he really forced a merger in '66 by going after the NFL's quarterbacks, and so you know, and then he came back and built a team that was great for a long time, and then he defied the NFL by taking the Raiders to L.A. without even asking them, and then winning the lawsuit. I mean, he just had an enormous impact on the game.
Glenn, this is Matt Miyoko, and you know, I think it's safe to say that you've had the ability to ruffle some feathers through the years. Is there any episode now, any clash with Al Davis that you look back on this morning and sort of laugh about the repartee that you two may have had?
Well, yeah, I can tell you exactly what happened. When I was covering the Raiders, we had a great relationship, as I said, you know, because he was a teacher and I was a pupil. And I respected him, and of course, I was just a beat writer. So, you know, and the Raiders were really good at that period of time. The first 3 years I covered them, they only lost 4 games combined in the regular season. They went to the Super Bowl, they won the championship game 3 years in a row. You know, it was a great team, so there wasn't much to criticize there. But when I became a columnist, and when Davis and Wayne Valley had their dispute over the ownership, I wrote a column saying that Davis was basically an ingrate because Valley had brought him to the club originally. He'd brought him back and allowed him to buy 10% of the club for all of $18,500, by the way, and made him managing general partner. And Davis was trying to force him out, which he did, of course. That ended our relationship. Davis and I never had a meaningful conversation after that. The man, you know, he was very good at dividing the world into us versus them. I had been part of us, and very quickly I was them for the rest of his life.
Glenn, when you wrote the book, Just Win, Baby, Al Davis and his Raiders, how much quality time were you able to spend with him one-on-one, and what did you learn about him on a personal level?
I spent no time at all with Al Davis for that book. I talked a lot to his friends and his enemies as well. You know, I talked to a lot of people about what happened and what went on, and Melvin Derslag and I had some very interesting conversations. Derslag was a columnist for the Los Angeles Examiner, Herald Examiner, I guess it was at that time, a real supporter of Davis in his move to the South and afterwards. You know, he was probably the only one newspaper man that Davis talked to on a regular basis. And we had a lot of interesting conversations about what kind of personality he was. And Derslag was very puzzled because he said Davis was the only guy who didn't want his good deeds publicized, but enjoyed having his bad ones publicized. You know, because when Hank Stram had a heart attack, Davis immediately found out who the best heart surgeon was supposed to be in the country and hired him to come in and paid for all the medical bills for Stram. When his wife, Davis's wife, had a near-fatal heart attack, in gratitude to the hospital, he paid for some new hospital beds for him, and never said a word about any of this. You know, only his friends would talk about it later, but he never said anything and never wanted it publicized. Very strange person.
Glenn, as big as the Raiders were in Oakland, in that first run, did you get the feeling that Al ever regretted moving that team to L.A. and really breaking the tie that organization had bonded with the city of Oakland and the fans in the East Bay?
Well, you know, Davis never admitted regrets about anything, but it did break the tie, and he went down there. You know, there was a lot of talk about, well, he wanted luxury boxes, blah, blah, blah. Well, as a matter of fact, the Coliseum had a plan to put in luxury boxes, but they wanted him to sign a 15-year lease to amortize them, and he would only sign for 5 years. And, you know, when the Haas family bought the A's, they signed the long-term lease, and that's when the luxury boxes were put in that are still there today. But Davis went down to L.A., and he had a verbal promise for the luxury boxes. And guess what? He never got them. He just wanted to go down there because he had been at USC, which owns L.A., has always owned L.A., even when they've had professional football teams there. And he thought that he could be as big with the Raiders as USC was, you know. And it just didn't happen. I mean, they were second string to the Rams. When I was working on the book, I was down there in 1990, and that was the year that the Raiders went to the championship game. They got beaten pretty thoroughly, but they were in the AFC championship game. The Rams were going nowhere. And that weekend I was down there, the Raiders were playing Kansas City in, you know, a vital game to win the division. And the Rams, I forget who they were playing, but it was a nothing game. But the Rams were on the front page of the L.A. Times. The Raiders were on page 5. So that shows you what kind of, you know, and the big star, of course, of the Raiders when they first went down there was Marcus Allen, who had won the Heisman Trophy at USC. Then he is the most valuable player in the Super Bowl. And guess what? He got benched. Davis didn't want to be eclipsed.
Glenn, I know it's not an easy question, but I'll throw it at you anyway because you've been covering sports for so long. When it comes to sports figures and their impact on the game of football, where does Al Davis rank?
Well, he ranks very close to the top because of what he did off the field as much as, you know, but with the organization that he built, with defying the NFL and showing that there are rules against having to get approval for a move were meaningless. You know, he just changed the whole game that way. So he had a tremendous influence on the sport. You know, I mean, a guy like Bill Walsh had a great influence on the playing field, you know, because the offenses around the league are, so many of them are modeled on Walsh's plan. But Davis didn't change it on the field that way because he basically used the same offense that Sid Gilman had used for the Chargers. But he was very effective with that. He was great at recognizing talent. You know, in his prime, which was mostly in Oakland, I think, you know, he was unexcelled at he brought in all these guys. Of course, at that time in the NFL, you know, teams, you couldn't talk back to the coach, especially if you were a black player. There's a lot of racism in the NFL, and Davis didn't pay attention to any of that, you know. He brought in black players who had been discarded by other teams just because they were troublemakers, quote unquote, which meant that they talked back to the coach. And Ike Lassiter was one of them. But he just really had, I mean, the game has changed a lot. The organization has changed a lot. You know, all these silly rules the NFL used to have about player conduct, how they should dress, you know, that type of thing, that's all gone by the wayside. And I think a lot of that was because Davis didn't believe any of it, you know. So, yeah, he had tremendous influence.
Glenn Dickey, longtime Bay Area columnist, sports columnist, really thank you for your time, sir.